They said the maid was no one, just a pair of tired hands that scrubbed the floors of a house she'd never be welcome in. And that's exactly why nobody saw it coming, when she was the one who tore the whole night apart, in the coldest corner of Baltimore's Harbor District, where old money whispers and older debts get settled in silence. There lived a man named Draco Valentine, 34 years old, a mafia boss whose name people spoke with care, if they dared to speak it at all. He wasn't what you'd expect. He wore dark wool sweaters instead of tailored suits, drove a car with no plates, and carried a faint scar along his left brow from the night a man he'd trusted for 2 decades betrayed his father, a wound that taught him one truth he never let go of, that the human heart can do more damage than any weapon ever forged. He spoke softly, and it was that softness that unsettled people, because a man who never needs to raise his voice already holds every ounce of power in the room. On the night his estate glowed for an engagement party meant to bind 2 powerful families together, his fiancée, Sienna Cross, 29 and polished to a careful shine, stood before every important guest, pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, and declared through shining tears that she was carrying Draco Valentine's child. The room believed her, every powerful man in it believed her, and Draco, who knew that couldn't possibly be true, felt the ground tilt beneath him. But 3 floors below the gilded chandeliers and the champagne, there was a woman named Naomi Hart, 27, a young widow with tired grace, and a 4-year-old son, whose breathing rattled softly in his sleep, a woman the whole household stared straight through as if she were made of glass. And just as Sienna's lie began to harden into truth, this overlooked woman took one quiet step forward and spoke 8 words that made the wine glass slip from the boss's fingers and shatter across the stone. 8 words that'd expose a secret nobody in that room was ready to hear. If a story about power, betrayal, and the quiet dignity of people the world refuses to see is the kind of story that moves you, then take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what we tell you next. Now let's go back to where it all began, to a cold October evening, and the moment a powerful man's carefully guarded world started to come apart. There are men who build empires so they can be seen, and there are men who build them so they never have to be seen again, and Draco Valentine belonged to the second kind. The morning of that fateful day began like every other morning for him, not in a gilded room with servants carrying trays of silver, but at a small diner tucked between a laundromat and a shoe repair shop at the end of the street, where the neon sign had been missing 1 letter for years and no one had bothered to fix it. He sat in his familiar corner seat, ordered a cup of black coffee with no sugar, and the older woman behind the counter poured it for him without asking, because she had poured that exact cup for him for nearly 4 years, never knowing that the quiet customer in the casual knitwear could buy the entire block with a single phone call. That was exactly how Draco preferred it, to be a shadow among ordinary people, to listen to real life striking against itself around him instead of flattery echoing through rooms of power. People often imagined a mafia boss had to wear his authority loudly, gleaming suits, heavy watches, roaring cars that made the whole city turn its head, but Draco had learned very early that true power did not need to shout. It only needed to be present, quietly and undeniably, like a chill slipping into a room before anyone realized a door had opened. He knew the name of every person working under him, not the way a boss memorized an employee list, but the way someone truly cared. He knew the old gatekeeper had a grandchild who had just started college, knew the young driver was saving to buy his first house, knew the cook at the mansion had back pain whenever the weather turned, and he remembered all of it not because it was useful for business, but because his father had once taught him that a man who forgot the names of those who served him had already begun losing himself. His father, Salvatore, the man who had built everything from empty hands and a promise, used to sit with young Draco late at night and say in that familiar, deep, rough voice that blood could buy loyalty for 1 night, but only respect could keep it for 10 years, and that an empire built on fear would collapse the moment fear disappeared, while an empire built on dignity would stand even after the man who built it had been laid in the ground. Those words had soaked into Draco like water into dry earth. And now, at 34 years old, he still kept his father's old tarnished badge in his desk drawer, touching it whenever he felt the world trying to pull him into becoming a man his father would no longer recognize. That was why he often inspected his empire quietly at hours no one expected. Without warning, without an entourage. Walking alone through hallways, harbor warehouses, offices hidden behind nameless doors, listening, observing, remembering. Because he believed people only revealed their true nature when they thought the boss was somewhere far away. But that October evening, the Valentine mansion was not quiet at all. It blazed with light from the main gate all the way to the roof, hundreds of ornate fixtures casting warm gold over the stone walls, piano music drifting through the great halls, the scent of lilies and expensive wine mingling in the air, luxury cars rolling one after another into the courtyard, carrying the most powerful faces of the two families that were about to be joined by a marriage. Tonight was his engagement party with Sienna Cross, an event planned carefully down to every flower, every glass of wine, every guest, an alliance both sides called love, while everyone silently understood. It was a contract written in the invisible ink of interest and ambition. Draco stood on the second-floor balcony looking down at the sea of people below, holding a glass of wine he had not touched, and inside him there was a strange feeling he could not name, like a hairline fracture, splitting through a pane of glass invisible at first, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. He watched Sienna gliding through the crowd below, with her carefully practiced smile, touching one person's shoulder, tilting her head to laugh with another, so perfect that he found himself wondering whether he had ever truly seen her at all, or had only seen the image she wanted him to see. He did not know that within only a few hours, this subtle sense of unease would rupture into an earthquake, that tonight, beneath the magnificent lights arranged to honor his power, something small and wholly unexpected was waiting for him in the darkest place inside his own house, and that the person who would change his life forever would not be any of the honored guests in that glittering hall, but someone no one there would bother to turn and look at all night. 3 floors below, where the crystal lights were shining, and the piano music was drifting, in a hidden corner no guest at the party would ever set foot in, a woman was kneeling as she scrubbed stains from the cold marble floor of the service wing, and her name was Naomi Hart. It had been 3 years since the day she walked through the back gate of the Valentine mansion in a uniform too large for her, and with a heart that had learned not to expect much from life anymore. And during those 3 years, she had cleaned the same hallways again and again, hallways she would never be allowed to walk through as an ordinary human being, only as a pair of hands, a quiet shadow moving along the walls in the hours before the world of the wealthy had even woken. Her shoulders bore the invisible weight of years spent in hardship, a silent struggle etched into her very posture. But no matter how much life wore her down, there was one thing it had never taken from her, the way she lifted her head whenever people looked through her as though she did not exist, a quiet dignity as stubborn and enduring as roots clinging to stone, not showy, not begging, simply refusing to fall. People in this mansion were used to looking at her, the way they looked at a useful object, necessary but invisible. And Naomi had learned that sometimes invisibility was a kind of armor, because the person no one saw was also free to observe everything. But tonight was not an ordinary night for her. Tonight was the anniversary of Daniel's death, the husband she had lost 4 years earlier in an accident at the construction site where he worked, a morning when he kissed her forehead and walked out the door like he did every day, and never came home again, leaving her with a newborn son and an emptiness no amount of time could ever fill. The construction company had quickly laid all the blame on the dead man himself to avoid paying a single dollar of compensation. And Naomi, too young, too exhausted, and too alone to fight an entire machine, had been forced to swallow that injustice, along with a mountain of bills and crushing debt. She had once studied nursing, dreaming of wearing a white coat and caring for others, but that dream had been folded away unfinished when she became pregnant and then lost the only support she had. And now the medical knowledge still left inside her was only enough for her to recognize when her son had trouble breathing in the middle of the night, enough for her to know how to soothe that small chest until his breath became even again. The boy's name was Eli. He was 4 years old, with messy curls and large dark eyes exactly like his father's, a child more fragile in health than other children his age, often wheezing softly in his sleep, so that many nights Naomi had to lie on her side, watching every rise and fall of him. Tonight she had been forced to bring Eli to work, because her usual sitter was busy, and she no longer had enough money to hire anyone else. So she settled him quietly in the staff break room with his old stuffed rabbit and told him to wait for his mother, intending, when her shift ended, to light a small candle for Daniel in a corner of the back courtyard, a private ritual only she knew about, a way to tell the man who was gone that she still remembered, that she was still trying, no matter how heavy everything became. There was one thing Naomi had never told anyone, a faint shard of memory she held close, the way people hold a glimmer of light through a long night, that on the most wretched night of her life, when Eli was only an infant and had gone into crisis and had to be rushed to the emergency room in a pounding rainstorm, when she stood before the billing desk with trembling hands and an empty wallet, a strange man had quietly stepped forward, paid the entire amount without offering a word of explanation, then turned and walked back into the rain before she could see his face clearly. She could not remember that face. The rain and her tears had blurred everything, but she remembered a very soft voice when he bent down and told her the baby would be all right, and she remembered his back fading into the darkness, a dark sweater soaked through with rain on his body. For the 4 years after that, that blurred figure had become a quiet lighthouse inside her heart, and when she happened to hear people whisper about the secretive owner of the Valentine mansion, a powerful but strange man, a man rumored to quietly help the unfortunate without ever leaving his name behind, a tiny hope had sparked inside her, an uncertain belief that maybe, just maybe, he was the one who had saved her son that night, and it was that fragile belief that had carried her tired feet to knock on this place and ask for a cleaning job, so that 3 years passed, and she was still quietly watching, still quietly waiting, without ever once coming close enough to learn the truth, until this very fateful night in October, while Naomi quietly carried her candle and her fragments of memory down into the service wing, 3 floors above, amid laughter and the sound of glasses touching. Something very subtle had begun to move inside the heart of the mansion, an invisible thread someone had pulled taut before anyone had time to notice. Draco was still standing on the second-floor balcony, with the glass of wine he had not touched, letting the piano music and scraps of polite conversation drift past his ears like water passing over stone, when the phone in his coat pocket gave a brief, quiet vibration, a signal whose meaning only he understood. It came from the security sensor system, and more precisely, from the service wing, that cold corner behind the mansion which, on a night of celebration like this, should have been entirely still and silent, where there was no reason for a motion sensor to be triggered, while every eye and every bit of attention was fixed on the main hall. Another man in his position might have merely frowned, waved for a guard, told him to go see what was happening, then returned to his wine and social smiles. But Draco was not that kind of man, and those who understood him knew that it was precisely the small details other people dismissed that sharpened all his senses into alertness. Because in the world he lived in, where the friendliest smiles sometimes hid the sharpest knives behind the back, he had learned that a small irregularity on the very night, when everything was supposed to be perfect, was rarely just a harmless coincidence, and that instinct, forged through too many losses, was now whispering softly to him that something was wrong. He glanced down into the hall below, where Sienna was still gliding through the crowd with her perfect smile, where the powerful guests of both families were still absorbed in the performance of an important evening, and he realized no one would notice if the host of the party quietly disappeared for a few minutes, and no one would suspect that the boss of an entire empire would personally go do the work of a gatekeeper. Draco set his wineglass down on the stone railing, slipped out of the costume of party host that he had never truly worn with comfort, and quietly left the balcony, passing through a side door into a service corridor most of the guests did not even know existed. The deeper he went toward the rear of the mansion, the farther the warm golden light and gentle music receded behind him, giving way to a colder silence entirely unlike it, fewer bulbs, barer walls, the air of a world those guests upstairs would never see and would never want to see. He pushed open the final door and stepped into the back courtyard, and at once the chill of the October night rushed in to wrap around him, sharp and clean, carrying the smell of damp cement and early fallen leaves slowly rotting in the dark corners. The rear courtyard stretched before him in a dim gray wash of darkness, lit only faintly by a single lamp hanging above the storage door. its trembling light spilling patchy stains across the ground as though even it were unsure whether it should reveal what was hidden here. Draco stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dark, and he listened, the way he had always listened, not only with his ears, but with some deeper sense honed through years of living along the edge of danger. There were no footsteps of an intruder, no metallic click of a plot taking shape, no sign at all of the threat the censor had warned him about, and that silence only tightened the cord of caution inside him further, because an alarm without a visible cause was more suspicious than an alarm with one. He wondered what had triggered it, a stray animal, a strong gust of wind shaking a door, or some deliberate hand, and that final thought slipped across his mind like a current of cold air, before he had time to push it aside, and tell himself he was becoming too suspicious on a night when he should have been relaxing. He did not yet know that his instinct had been right, that this seemingly baseless alarm was no accident at all, but the first piece in a board that someone had arranged long ago, a calculated move meant to pull him away from the great hall at exactly the decisive moment, and that when he took a few more steps into that cold darkness, he would come face to face with the thing that would throw the entire dark plan off course in a way no schemer could have foreseen, because in this shadowed and freezing back courtyard, there was no enemy waiting for him, only a sound, very soft and very fragile, just beginning to drift from behind the stack of old wooden crates in the corner by the wall. Draco followed that fragile sound, his steps quiet on the cold ground, and when he rounded the stack of old wooden crates in the corner by the wall, what he saw made all the tension of vigilance in his chest suddenly loosen, dissolving into something far gentler that even he could not name in time. There was no intruder, no threat crouching in the dark, only a very small boy sitting curled up in the hidden corner, a child of about 4 with messy curls and large eyes brimming with tears, clutching a battered plush toy, whose fur had been worn nearly bare, as though it were the only precious thing left in the world. The boy had gotten lost, surely only a short distance, perhaps following someone's footsteps through the wrong door, and then wandering until he could not find his way back. And now he sat there in the cold of the October night, sleepy and frightened, his breathing coming in soft, wheezing little sounds that were becoming strained, the kind of breath of a child whose small chest was being squeezed by fear and cold together. Draco stood still for a moment, and in that moment, the man all of Baltimore knew to fear, the boss of an empire built from blood and silence, was suddenly nothing more than a human being, looking at a tiny life that needed help. He did not shout, did not call for guards, did nothing that might frighten the boy further. Instead, he slowly lowered himself, kneeling on one knee on the cold ground so his eyes were level with the child's tear-filled ones, making himself smaller, gentler, so the boy could see that the tall shadow that had just appeared in the dark was not something to fear. "Hello, there," he said, in the very soft voice he often used, except this time that softness carried no power and no threat, only plain tenderness. "You're all right. I'm here now. Breathe slowly with me, all right? Take a gentle breath in, then let it out nice and slow." The boy looked up at him with the eyes of a child deciding whether this stranger could be trusted, that brutally honest gaze only children have, the kind adults lose long ago. And Draco stayed exactly as he was, patient and calm, quietly guiding him to breathe in and out with his own slow rhythm. He took off the coat he was wearing, his familiar charcoal pullover, and gently wrapped it around the boy's trembling shoulders, gathering that tiny body into the warmth still left in the fabric. And little by little, almost miraculously, the labored wheezing began to ease, the boy's breathing becoming steadier, deeper, his small chest no longer rising and falling in panic but finding its peaceful rhythm again. "That's it," Draco murmured. "See? You can do it." And a faint smile passed over the boy's tear-wet face, a tired but trusting smile. And then something Draco had not expected happened. The boy, as though he had made up his small mind that this man was safe, shifted closer and leaned his whole body into Draco's arms, pressing his cheek against his chest, the stuffed rabbit caught between them. Something inside Draco's chest moved, something all his years of living among power and guardedness had never touched, because a child choosing to trust someone was not a small thing. It was the clearest and purest vote of faith a human being could receive, without calculation, without condition, with no concern for who he was or how much money he had, only the simple understanding that he had lowered himself to the child's level when no one else had. And Draco. The man who never let himself soften simply sat there on the cold ground of the rear courtyard, one hand supporting the small back slowly warming beneath his touch, unwilling to move, unwilling to break that fragile moment. The boy was already drifting drowsily in his arms, his lashes lowering, and as he hovered between waking and sleep, he softly murmured. A call Draco knew must have been meant for the mother somewhere searching frantically for him. "Mama," the boy breathed, and Draco was about to reassure him that he would bring him back to his mother, when the child mumbled one more thing, a name so faint it nearly blended into his breath. "Uncle Sal," he said, and then slipped fully into exhausted sleep. Draco went still, something running down his spine because Sal was his father's nickname, Salvatore's name, a name almost no one spoke anymore, and for one moment he sat motionless in the darkness, holding a strange child who had just spoken that name, wondering how a 4-year-old boy he had never met could utter a name belonging to the deepest past of his life, before he pushed the thought aside the way a man dismisses a dream upon waking, telling himself he must have misheard the sleep mumbles of a tired child, never knowing that the name spoken in the dark was the first thread of a tapestry of fate that had been woven long before this October night, before Draco could free himself from the strange feeling left behind by the name just spoken in the darkness. The whole corner of the rear courtyard suddenly flared with a harsh white glare, and the heavy footsteps of many people at once came pounding from the direction of the storage door. Cutting through the fragile stillness that had just been built, a group of broad-shouldered men in black surged out of the darkness. They were temporary security guards hired for the party, men whose faces Draco had never seen before, and whose existence he had never even known about. Men brought in to stand watch under the name of the Cross family, without him having bothered to ask enough questions. And now, as their flashlights swept across his face, what they saw was not the boss of an entire empire, but only a strange, dust-stained man crouched in a hidden corner of a restricted area with a sleeping child in his arms. To the eyes of men accustomed to judging people only by appearances, that image was instantly framed as the worst thing they could imagine, and one of them shouted in a voice thick with suspicion and hostility, "Stay where you are. Put the kid down right now. Who the hell are you sneaking in here?" At that exact tense moment, a figure rushed out from the staff break room door, and Naomi, with the heart of a mother who had sensed her child from the distance of instinct itself, dropped to her knees beside Draco, her trembling hands taking Eli from his arms and gathering the drowsy boy tightly against her chest. "He's my son," she said quickly, her voice choking with fear and relief at the same time. "He got lost. He only got lost," and she looked at Draco for one brief moment with an almost indescribable gratitude before rising with her child in her arms, carrying Eli back inside where there was warmth and light, laying him down on the long bench in the break room, far away from the air that was growing thicker by the second in the rear courtyard. Only when the boy had been carried somewhere safe, out of sight and beyond whatever danger might come next, did the security men truly turn on the strange man still kneeling on the ground. 2 powerful men hauled Draco to his feet by the arms, shoved him hard against the cold stone wall, and pinned both his arms behind his back with all the brutality of men who believed they were restraining a criminal, while one of them grabbed him by the collar and yanked, demanding through clenched teeth to know who he was and what he had intended to do here. And this was the strangest thing of all, because all Draco had to do was speak a few words. All he had to do was say the name Valentine, and in an instant those men would let him go and fall to their knees in terror. But he did not do it. He let his back be pressed against a stone wall, let his collar be tightened in a rough fist, and he remained silent, a silence so calculated and cold it was almost chilling, because inside his mind, which was always working, a chain of irregular pieces was quietly locking into place. The sensor that had gone off without reason in the middle of the party, the unfamiliar security team he had never approved, appearing in this secluded area at exactly this moment. The way they had been positioned as if they had known someone would appear here, every piece of the puzzle pointed toward a single chilling reality. A traitor was operating in the shadows. If he hurried to declare his identity now, he would only make whoever stood behind all of this pull back into the darkness, more cautious, more guarded, and his chance to see the whole board would vanish. But if he continued playing the role of a nameless man no one looked twice at, he could watch where this thread led, who would appear next, who would reveal himself inside this trap that had already been set. So he chose silence, not because he could not save himself, but because he wanted to loosen the line and follow it to the prey hiding at the other end. And he only spoke softly, in a low voice that was strangely calm in the middle of that dangerous moment. "Why are you holding so tight?" "I'm not running anywhere." And that misplaced calm made one of the security men freeze for an instant, a flicker of confusion passing through his eyes, because an innocent man would panic and a guilty man would beg, but this man did neither. He only stood there, pinned against the wall, looking straight at them with the eyes of someone holding something they knew nothing about, and the air in the rear courtyard suddenly grew heavy, in a way none of those men could explain. That hard-to-explain tension had not yet had time to settle, when the sound of leather shoes struck the courtyard floor, steady and decisive, and from the service corridor emerged a man with the bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders. It was August Reyes, Draco's right hand, the head steward who had served the Valentine family for many years, and held in his hands the authority to manage almost everything that happened inside the mansion. The beam of a flashlight swept across the courtyard, and in the instant the face of the man pinned against the wall appeared clearly beneath that harsh light. Draco saw the exact second when August's eyes touched his face and recognized who he was, a recognition that could not be mistaken, flashing briefly before vanishing from the depths of the man's gaze. Yet instead of panicking and ordering them to let him go, instead of the reaction any loyal servant should have had upon seeing his master pinned by common guards against a stone wall, August did something that a very deep corner of Draco's mind quietly recorded the way one records a wrong note in a melody. He hesitated, only for a moment, a pause so brief that no one but Draco would have noticed it. Then he turned to the security men and said in a superior tone, "You did well. Keep him held. A ragged man sneaking into a restricted area at night like this can't have any decent intentions." Then August walked over at an unhurried pace, folded his arms across his chest, and looked Draco up and down with the cold contempt of someone accustomed to sorting human beings into valuable and worthless with a single glance. And he let loose his bitter words. "Look at you. Nothing but a common vagrant sneaking into a restricted area." August sneered, looking down at Draco with unvarnished contempt. "The nerve of your kind, thinking you can steal from this estate." At that moment Naomi came out of the break room after carefully tucking a blanket around Eli and making sure her son was sleeping safely in the warmth, and she hurried to defend the strange man who had just helped her child. "Mr. Reyes, it isn't like that," she said. "This man didn't do anything wrong. He was the one who found my son when the boy wandered off. He helped him." But August did not even bother to turn and look at her properly. He only glanced sideways at the cleaning woman, trying to explain herself with the kind of look people gave to an inconvenience that had spoken at the wrong time. And he said through clenched teeth, "What would you know? You brought a child into this mansion on an important night like this, and then let him run all over the place. Do you know that if the guests hear about this, you'll lose your job immediately? People like you should know your place and keep your head down. This is not somewhere for you to drag your private troubles and your child into." Those words struck Naomi like invisible lashes, and Draco, still pinned hard against the wall, watched the whole scene in silence, watched the way one person used his small measure of power to trample another person simply because she stood lower than him in the invisible order society had built. He saw Naomi lower her head, not because she believed she had done wrong, but because she was far too used to swallowing insults like this. The bowed posture of someone life had taught that resistance only brought more pain, and something inside Draco's chest quietly engraved that image there, not with loud fury, but with a silent, cold awakening to what had been happening inside his own house when he was not there to see it. But beneath that layer of feeling, the part of his mind that never stopped calculating was busy with another question, because he noticed that August was acting strangely eager. The man was urging the security team to drag this stranger away quickly, wanting to remove both the man suspected of being a thief and the mother with her child from the service wing as fast as possible, as though something here was making him uneasy, as though the presence of these uninvited eyes in the rear courtyard on this particular night was a nuisance he needed to clear away with more haste than necessary. An ordinary steward would have been merely irritated, but August was almost anxious. and that urgency hidden beneath the mask of contempt was one more detail Draco stored in a sealed compartment of his mind. A piece whose shape was not yet clear, a piece he could not yet place anywhere, but also one he did not dismiss, because he had lived long enough in his world to understand that people in a hurry to chase something away were often people with something to hide. Draco had seen enough and heard enough, and now it was time for him to end this little performance in his own way. So he shifted his shoulder slightly, a movement that seemed harmless, but was decisive enough that the two security men holding him suddenly felt their grip loosen, and in that same low voice, still as calm as though nothing had happened, he told August to order his men to step back, that he would stand on his own, and there was something in the quiet authority radiating from that dust-stained man that made even August instinctively gesture for the guards to release him. Though the contemptuous look had not yet left his face, Draco brushed the dust from his shoulder at an unhurried pace. Then instead of leaving as August was so clearly hoping he would, he turned and walked straight into the staff break room, the small room where Naomi had just laid her son down, leaving the steward behind him wearing an expression caught between surprise and irritation. In the warm room dimly lit by yellow light, Eli had woken a little from his short sleep. He was sitting up on the long bench and rubbing his eyes, his stuffed rabbit still clutched tightly in his arms, and when he saw the tall man come in, instead of being frightened, his small face lit up with recognition, as though he were seeing an old friend again. Draco found an old kettle in the corner of the room, and under Naomi's stunned gaze, the man all of Baltimore bowed before made 2 cups of warm water with his own hands, gave one to the mother and took the other, blowing across it to cool it, then sat down right on the floor so his eyes were once again level with the boys, gently placing the warm cup into those tiny hands. "Drink a little of this to warm your belly, young man," he said, and Eli accepted the cup with both hands, solemnly took a small sip, then looked up at him with satisfaction before lifting his worn old stuffed rabbit with all the pride of a 4-year-old child. "This is Bunny," he said. "He got lost like me, but I found him. He's very brave." Draco nodded with complete seriousness, as though he had just been introduced to an important figure. "I'm honored to meet Bunny," he replied, "and he is very brave. Just as brave as his owner." That made Eli giggle, a bright, innocent ripple of laughter that swept away the last traces of fear still lingering on his face, and the boy began chattering to him about how Bunny liked orange carrots and hated the dark, while Draco listened to every word with the attentiveness of a man receiving the most vital information in the world. Naomi stood silently nearby, holding the cup of warm water in both hands without having taken a single sip, and she watched the scene with a confusion rising inside her that she could not explain, because after so many years of being trampled by life, she had learned that kindness in this world was rarely free, that behind every hand extended toward her, there was usually a price to pay, a condition, an exchange, and she had grown used to being wary of every unexpected kindness the way a wounded animal is wary of every hand reaching out. But this man was different. He asked nothing from her, did not look at her with condescending pity, did not wait for a flustered thank you, or some bowed display of gratitude. He simply sat there on the floor, making warm water and talking to her son about a stuffed rabbit, treating the little child of a poor maid with exactly the respect one gives to a human being, no more and no less. And it was precisely that ordinary lack of calculation that made her hardened heart tremble with a strange new beat. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said softly, her voice slightly unsteady. "You didn't have to do all this. A stranger like you, after being treated like that out there, and yet you're still sitting here worrying about the boy." Draco looked up at her, and in his eyes there was no sense of bestowing favor, only something so warm and honest that she had to lower her gaze slightly. "You don't owe me any thanks," he answered. "The boy needed help, and I was there. It's as simple as that. Anyone worthy of being called human would do the same, no matter how often people out there seem to forget it." The words hung in the warm air of the small room, and Naomi looked at the strange man sitting on the floor with her son, while a vague familiarity stirred somewhere deep inside her that she could not yet name, something in that very soft voice brushing against a dusty chamber of memory long closed away. But then Eli tugged at the man's sleeve, asking him to continue the story about Bunny, and that fragile moment slipped past before she could grasp it, leaving behind a warm echo in her heart, and a question with no answer. After lingering a little longer in that small, warm room, long enough to be certain that Eli had fully calmed down, and Naomi had eased out of her tension, Draco quietly rose to his feet, told the boy to take very good care of Bunny, then silently left the annex to return to the party waiting for him upstairs. But what had just happened in the back garden still clung to his mind like smoke that refused to clear. He didn't take the main hallway. Instead, he chose a roundabout path through a quieter part of the mansion, partly because he wasn't ready to put the mask of the host back on too quickly, and partly because the wary instinct inside him still hadn't gone to sleep. It urged him to pass by his study once, that private room where, on a night of celebration like this, no one was supposed to enter. That detour led him along a long corridor floored in dark wood, where the music and laughter from the grand hall had faded into a faint echo, like the sound of another world, and when he neared the door of his study, his footsteps suddenly slowed, because he noticed a band of golden light spilling out through the crack of a door left ajar, and with it came the very soft sounds of a conversation that shouldn't have existed. Draco stopped completely, drew himself into the shadowed edge of the hallway, and held his breath to listen. The instinct that had saved his life countless times now stretched tight inside him like a violin string. There were two people inside the study, and he recognized one of the voices at once. It was Sienna, his fiancée, only that voice now carried nothing of the rehearsed gentleness she always wore in front of others. It was sharp, cold, tense, and threaded with an unease he had never heard in her before. The other voice belonged to a man deep and low, speaking with the careful restraint of someone accustomed to whispering in the dark, and no matter how hard Draco strained his ears, he couldn't see the man's face through the narrow crack in the door. He could only hear the cold, calculating note in every word the man uttered. "Everything has to happen exactly as planned tonight," the man said softly. "Once the alliance is sealed, there'll be no turning back for anyone. You understand that, don't you? This is the only chance, and you mustn't let it slip away. Every eye in that grand hall is waiting, and as long as you do your part properly, I'll take care of the rest." Sienna answered in a trembling voice. "But what if he doesn't believe it? What if everything falls apart? I'll be the one who has to carry all of it." The man cut her off with firm, merciless coldness. "He'll believe it, because he won't have any other choice once you've announced it in front of both families. Honor will bind his hands." Then his voice dropped even lower, whispering something Draco could only catch in fragments, a sentence swallowed by the darkness until only a few broken words remained about the baby. "And as for the baby, leave that alone for now. When the time comes, there'll be a way to handle it." Draco stood motionless in the darkness of the hallway, and inside his chest, that vague sense of something being 1 degree out of place. The feeling he had carried with him all evening suddenly broke open into a clear and freezing shape, because he had just heard his own fiancée conspiring with a hidden man in some scheme aimed straight at him, a trap being laid on the very night of his own engagement. Beneath the crystal lights that had been lit to honor the alliance, he now understood, was only a curtain drawn over calculations, far darker than he had imagined. He wanted to shove that door open, wanted to look directly into the face of the man whispering inside and force him to answer, but the cold, seasoned part of his mind held him back in time, because he knew that if he acted in that moment, he would catch only one small strand of the web and miss the spider spinning it, and the people behind it would have time to deny, to destroy evidence, to retreat into the shadows and wait for another chance, one even more dangerous. So he forced himself to stand still, forced himself to swallow the fury rising inside him, and he silently stepped back, one slow step at a time, into the darkness, engraving every word he had just heard into his memory, especially that unfinished fragment about the baby, the piece whose full meaning he still couldn't understand. A new question planted in his heart, more painful than all the questions that had come before it, and he turned away in silence, carrying with him a truth that had only just begun to reveal itself, a truth he knew would change everything before this fateful night came to an end. Draco had not even made it far from the hallway outside the study, his mind still in turmoil from the words he had just overheard, when the sound of small hurried footsteps chased after him from behind, bare feet stumbling across the wooden floor, mingled with a young, breathless voice calling out, "Mister, wait for me." And when he turned around, he saw Eli running toward him, one arm clutching his tattered companion, the other hand gripping some tiny object, his cheeks flushed from the effort, while Naomi followed anxiously behind him. The boy ran up to him, panting hard, but his face was bright with the pride of someone who had just completed an important mission. Then he opened his little hand, and lying in the center of his palm was a glittering engagement ring, its large stone catching the light and scattering tiny sparks. "You dropped this when you let me borrow your warm coat," Eli said, his voice full of seriousness. "I found it on the floor. I kept it very carefully and didn't lose it. I'm giving it back to you now." Draco lowered his eyes to the ring resting in the child's palm, and for one moment he forgot the plot, the betrayal, and the party waiting for him, because that small, glittering object was the very ring Sienna had chosen herself, the upgraded ring whose link she had sent him from a luxury magazine, telling him to order it, a larger stone, a more elaborate design than the simple ring he had once intended to give her, and he had carried it with him for weeks as if carrying a duty he had never truly wanted to fulfill. He took the ring from E. Seeley's hand, and that cold metal touched his skin with a strange heaviness, far heavier than its real weight, because now, after everything he had just heard through the crack of the study door, it was no longer only a ring. It had become the embodiment of an entire relationship built on a foundation of lies and calculation. "Thank you," Draco said softly to the boy. "You're a very trustworthy person." Eli grinned with deep satisfaction at the praise, then turned and whispered something to Bunny as if boasting about his achievement, innocent and clear-hearted, completely unaware of how heavy the little object his tiny hands had just placed back into that man's hand truly was. Draco stood still, the ring enclosed in his clenched palm, and he felt a painful irony lodge in his throat, because this very child, the son of a poor maid whom the whole mansion looked through as though he didn't exist, had just returned to him the very thing that, deep in his heart, he had longed to let go of for a long time, as though fate itself were borrowing the boy's innocent hands to place back into Draco's grasp a question he had avoided for too long. Whether he truly wanted to put this ring on the hand of a woman his heart had never really belonged to, or whether it was time for him to have the courage to look straight at the truth. Naomi had just managed to catch up. She placed a hand on her son's shoulder and lowered her head slightly in embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she said. "He insisted on running after you to return it no matter what. He said that if something belongs to someone else, it has to be given back." Draco lifted his gaze to her, and there was something in his eyes both gentle and distant. "You've taught your son very well," he said. "He understands something that many adults upstairs have forgotten, that whatever doesn't belong to you shouldn't be kept." The sentence seemed to be about more than just the ring, and Naomi looked briefly bewildered, unable to fully grasp the deeper meaning in his words. But she could feel the strange weight settling over that moment, the way this unfamiliar man looked at the ring in his hand, as though he were looking at a shackle rather than a pledge of betrothal. In that suspended instant, 3 people stood in the dark hallway: an innocent child holding a stuffed animal, a poor mother with calloused hands, and a crime lord tightening his fist around the symbol of a false promise, and none of them said another word, because there are moments when silence speaks everything by itself, and Draco knew, in that very second he knew, that this ring would never be placed on Sienna Cross's hand. That quiet moment, so heavy with meaning, eventually passed when Eli gave a long yawn and rubbed his head against his mother's leg, and Naomi softly told him to go back into the resting room and sit quietly a little longer, reminding him to hold Bunny and wait while she finished cleaning this area. Then the 2 of them would go home. The boy obediently did as he was told and scampered back inside, leaving the 2 adults standing in the dark hallway, where the air slowly settled into something different, deeper and more intimate. Draco still didn't hurry away. There was something about this woman that held him there. Perhaps the quiet dignity she carried even while being trampled on, perhaps the faint, familiar feeling he still couldn't name. And he gently asked whether tonight was a special night, because he had noticed a small white candle peeking out of the pocket of her apron, an object strangely out of place among the cleaning supplies. Naomi startled slightly, her hand instinctively lifting to cover the candle as though shielding a private thing that had just been seen. Then she let out a soft breath, and perhaps because darkness made it easier for people to be honest, or because this man had treated her son with a kindness she herself had almost never received, she quietly said that tonight was the anniversary of her husband's death. She said she still had the habit of lighting a small candle for him in a corner of the back garden. After each shift, a private ritual between herself and the man who was gone. A way for her to tell him that she still remembered, that she was still trying to move forward, no matter how heavy each step felt. She said nothing more about her losses, not a single word of complaint, not a single tear displayed for pity. Yet the way she cradled that small candle in her palm said everything about the weight of all those years she had silently carried alone. And Draco, a man far too accustomed to bearing his own wounds in silence, recognized in her an unexpected kind of kinship, the dignity of a person who knew pain but didn't collapse beneath it. Then, as if to move away from the heaviness that had just been revealed, Naomi quietly added something she had meant to keep to herself, something that her sharp, observant eyes, the eyes of a woman who had once studied nursing before that dream was folded away unfinished, had accidentally noticed during the times she cleaned Miss Sienna's private room. She hesitated, unsure whether she should say it aloud. But then she softly continued, saying she was worried about the future mistress's health, because for the past several weeks, while cleaning the room, she had come across blister packs of medicine that a woman in the condition Miss Sienna so often claimed to be in shouldn't have been taking. These were medicines that, with the little medical knowledge Naomi still retained, she knew for certain weren't meant for someone expecting a tiny life to come into the world. She said it carefully, and with nothing but good intentions, like one woman worrying about another woman, completely unaware that the small piece of information she had just let slip was, in truth, a fragment with devastating force, a key she was placing in Draco's hand, without having any idea what door it would open. Draco listened to every word she said, and outwardly he kept his usual calm, but inside him, that piece of information instantly fitted itself to the unfinished fragment he had heard through the crack of the study door about the baby. Two separate pieces suddenly touched, and began to give off the cold light of a truth, slowly coming into view. He looked at the woman before him with a new respect, because he understood that she had just unknowingly given him something even his own trusted inner circle couldn't have obtained, the kind of truth only a shadowy observer could see and hold, someone free to observe everything precisely because no one bothered to notice her. "Thank you for telling me this," he said quietly. "And don't worry. I believe you've just done something far kinder than you realize." Then he looked once more at the small candle in her hand. "I hope you'll be able to light that candle in peace tonight. The man you've lost must be very proud of you." That simple sentence made Naomi's eyes sting, because it had been a very long time since anyone had spoken to her with such gentleness, and she stood there, holding the candle in her calloused palm, watching the back of that unfamiliar man disappear into the dark hallway, carrying with him a truth she still didn't fully understand, heading toward the party where everything was about to shatter. On his way back to the grand hall, Draco had not yet reached the end of the corridor when one of his longtime trusted men, a man named Marlowe who had served the family since the days when Draco's father was still alive, quietly approached him with a tense expression and leaned close to his ear to deliver bad news. There was now evidence that one of the warehouse managers at the docks, a man named Prentice, had secretly been feeding information about the family's shipping routes to a rival gang in exchange for money. Draco stopped walking, and in that instant, the tenderness he had carried with him, from the small room where Eli and Bunny were waiting, vanished, giving way to something colder and sharper, the true face of the man who stood at the head of an empire, the kind of man whose slightest lift of an eyebrow was enough to make those beneath him hold their breath. He told Marlowe to bring Prentice to him in a quiet side room completely separated from the party, and a few minutes later, the warehouse manager was led in, his face drained of all color, his trembling hands clasped tightly together, because in the world they lived in, everyone understood that betraying the Valentine family was something a man wasn't supposed to survive long enough to speak of afterward. Draco sat in a single chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand on the table. He simply looked straight into the eyes of the man, standing frozen before him with a silence so steady it was chilling, then asked softly, in a calm voice more frightening than any shout, "Do you know what I hate most, Prentice?" And without waiting for an answer, he went on. "What I hate most is having to discover that someone I trusted chose to sell that trust to someone else, because money can be earned back, but once trust is broken, There isn't any glue in the world that can put it together again." The man collapsed to his knees, stammering pleas for mercy, confessing that he had done it because he was desperate, because his little daughter was gravely ill and needed a large sum of money for treatment, and his wages could never cover it. He had thought it would only be one time, just one small piece of information, and no one would ever know. Hearing that, something in Draco's eyes seemed to soften for the briefest moment, because he remembered what his father had once taught him, that a leader had to know the difference between a man who betrayed out of greed and a man who stumbled because he had been pushed to the edge, and that justice without compassion was nothing more than cruelty dressed in moral clothing. He remained silent for a long time, then spoke, and the judgment he delivered surprised even Marlowe standing beside him. He said Prentice would never again set foot at the docks or in any facility belonging to the family, that his career in this world was over forever, and that this was the firm and unchangeable price of betrayal, because mercy didn't mean indulgence, and an empire couldn't survive if betrayal carried no cost. But then he added one more thing, in a voice that had softened. He would take care of the hospital bills for Prentice's daughter, not to buy silence, not because Prentice deserved it, but because an innocent child shouldn't have to pay for her father's mistake. And because if Prentice had dared come, knock on Draco's door from the beginning, and tell the truth about his situation, instead of secretly selling off trust in the dark, everything might have been very different. Prentice looked up at him, his eyes filled with both astonishment and shame, tears rolling down his worn, haggard face, and he stammered, unable to form a proper word. Draco only waved a hand, signaling Marlowe to take him away, unwilling to hear another word of gratitude, because to him this wasn't a favor. It was simply the moral line he had drawn for himself and would never allow himself to cross. When the room was empty except for him, Draco sat in silence, and he touched the pocket where he kept his father's old tarnished badge, the object he always carried with him like a moral compass, and he quietly thought that this was the true weight of the crown that no one ever saw. Not the right to command others, but the responsibility of weighing each human fate placed in his hands, of constantly asking himself whether he was acting like a tyrant or like a man, in a world where the line between the two was so thin that a single moment of weakness or cruelty could erase it entirely. His father had once told him that power was like fire. It could warm an entire home or burn everything to the ground, and the only difference lay in the hand that held it. And Draco, sitting alone in the empty room in the middle of a night when his whole world was waiting to fall apart, understood that he had once again chosen to warm rather than destroy, just as his father had always hoped he would. Then he rose, straightened his collar, drew in a deep breath, and stepped out of the room to return to the glittering grand hall, where his fiancée and a hidden man were waiting to make the move they believed would bind him. Unaware that the man about to step into that crystal light was no longer prey in their game, but a hunter who had already caught the scent of betrayal, Draco stepped back into the grand hall, and the very moment he appeared beneath the arch of golden light cast by the crystal chandeliers, the entire room seemed to shift with an invisible rhythm. Heads turned, eyes followed, social smiles bloomed across the faces of the distinguished guests from both families, because he was the center of this night, the future groom, the man whose coming marriage would bind two empires together into one enormous body of power. Yet the man walking unhurriedly through that sea of people was no longer the same man who had left this hall at the beginning of the evening. On the outside, he still wore his familiar composure and courtesy, still gave small nods in response to congratulations, still let a faint smile pass across his lips whenever someone lifted a glass toward him. But inside, after everything he had witnessed and heard within the few short hours that had just passed, something had changed forever, as though he were now looking at this entire glittering room through a completely new pane of glass. The ostentatious atmosphere of the party, the expensive clothes, the crisp laughter that sounded a little too false, the polished compliments passing back and forth among the guests, all of it suddenly appeared before his eyes like an elaborate play in which everyone was performing their role perfectly, a stage of masks where hardly anyone revealed their true face, and he, who had always felt out of place on stages like this, now saw more clearly than ever the distance between the people laughing and talking around him and the raw, naked truth he had just touched in that dark annex below. His gaze moved across the crowd and stopped on Sienna, who was standing at the center of a group of guests with a glass of champagne in her hand, radiant and flawless in her magnificent evening gown, her hair arranged in an intricate updo, her smile polished down to its every curve. For one moment he wondered how he could have stood beside a person for all this time, and never once truly seen through that shining shell now. As he looked at her with new eyes from which the film of naive trust had been scraped clean, he began to notice details he had once ignored. The way her eyes occasionally darted toward the door leading to the corridor, as though she were waiting for some signal. The way her fingers tightened a little too firmly around the stem of her glass, betraying a hidden tension beneath her effortless smile. The way her chest rose and fell slightly faster than usual whenever someone mentioned the wedding. She was anxious. He recognized it clearly. She was waiting and restless like an actress about to step into the most important scene of the entire performance, and he, the one who had accidentally learned the script in advance, watched everything in silence from the distance of a man who had awakened from a dream. Sienna caught his gaze from across the room, and her face immediately softened into a bright smile. She slipped away from the group of guests and came toward him with the graceful walk that had been refined through all the years she had grown up wrapped in silk and privilege. "There you are," she said when she came close, her voice sweet, though he could now hear the rigid note hidden underneath it. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Where did you disappear to and leave me alone to receive the guests? Everyone has been asking about you." Draco looked at her, and he smiled, a calm smile that revealed none of what was surging inside him. "I had a little matter to handle," he answered gently. "I'm here now." And he saw her eyes examine his face for a brief instant, as if checking whether he knew anything. Then she smiled again, reassuring herself, and slipped her hand into the crook of his arm with the intimacy of a fiancé. Standing so close to her, feeling her warmth and the familiar scent of her perfume, Draco suddenly felt a distant sadness rise inside him. Not the anger he had expected, but a quiet regret for something that perhaps had never truly existed between them, a relationship built on benefit and performance instead of genuine love. And he knew that no matter how this night ended, the road between him and Sienna had reached its point of judgment. He turned his eyes across the grand hall one final time, noting the position of every person. His gaze briefly pausing on the corridor door Sienna kept glancing toward, wondering where the hidden man from the study was standing now among this crowd, which guest's face he was wearing, what moment he was waiting for before pulling the controlling string. Draco's hand tightened slightly, feeling the weight of the ring still resting in his coat pocket, ready for the moment he knew was about to descend. The moment when all the masks in this room would begin to fall. Just as the piano had finished, ringing out the final notes of a piece, and the entire grand hall sank into a natural silence, Sienna suddenly let go of Draco's arm and stepped back, separating herself from him so she could stand in the center of the light, where every eye could see her most clearly, and that movement, which seemed accidental, was calculated with such precision that the whole room fell instinctively quiet and turned toward her. She lifted one hand and gently pressed it against her stomach, a gesture so full of implication that anyone could understand it at once, then raised her shimmering, tear-filled eyes to Draco, and in a trembling voice just loud enough for both families to hear, she spoke. "Draco, I'm sorry I chose this moment, but I can't hide it anymore. I need everyone to know on this important night that I'm carrying your child." That sentence fell into the stillness of the grand hall like a stone thrown into the glass-smooth surface of a lake, and in the first instant there was absolute shock. Then the entire room broke open into a wave of commotion, startled whispers spreading from one group of guests to another, hands lifting to cover mouths, eyes brightening with curiosity and excitement, because for the privileged crowd thirsting for a fine piece of drama, nothing could have been more captivating than such a theatrical declaration in the middle of an engagement party. Sienna's mother raised a hand to her chest in a show of emotion. Her father wore the satisfied smile of a man who had just seen his card turned over exactly as he had intended. And throughout the grand hall, people began turning to congratulate one another, lifting glasses, whispering about a wedding that had now become more certain than ever, about an alliance that would be bound not only by vows but by shared blood. The entire room believed her. Every powerful person in that glittering hall believed her, because who would dare question tears that looked so sincere? Who would doubt a woman brave enough to stand between two families and reveal something so sacred? There was only one person in that room who didn't join the rising tide of emotion, and it was the very man at whom the declaration had been aimed. Draco stood rooted in place, and for one brief moment his face went deathly pale, not with the joy of a man about to become a father, but with absolute numbness because he knew more certainly than anything else in the world, that the words Sienna had just spoken couldn't possibly be true. He and she had been estranged for many months. Their relationship had long since cooled into a formal arrangement, a shell maintained for the interests of two families, and no longer holding even the smallest warmth of a pair of lovers. And he, more than anyone, knew that the tiny life she had just claimed to be carrying couldn't possibly be his child. In that stunned moment, amid the murmurs rising around him like a tide, Draco's mind suddenly flared with a freezing clarity, because every scattered piece he had quietly gathered throughout the evening abruptly fitted together into a complete and merciless picture. The groundless alarm at the annex, the signal that had drawn him away from this grand hall at exactly the right time, now appeared to him no longer as some accidental disturbance, but as a coldly calculated move. It had been arranged to pull him away, to create an opening, so this performance could have been delivered while he was absent, or when he returned confused and disoriented, unprepared, unguarded, forced to react from a helpless position beneath countless watching eyes. They had wanted to drive him into a corner, wanted to use honor and the pressure of an entire crowd to bind him tight, leaving him no path except to acknowledge, to marry, to lock into place the alliance they desired. And if he had not happened upon a lost little boy in the dark back garden, if he had not lingered long enough to hear and see things he was never meant to know, then perhaps in this very moment he truly would have been pushed into the trap they had laid for him. Draco slowly drew in a breath, feeling anger and understanding rise together in his chest, and he looked straight into Sienna's tear-wet eyes waiting for a reaction from him, pleading for him to step into the role they had written in advance. But instead of the panic or submission the person behind all this had expected, a terrifying calm gradually appeared on Draco's face, the calm of a man who had seen through the entire game and knew it was now his turn to move, and the whole grand hall, though no one yet understood what was truly happening, suddenly felt a vague chill run down their spines as the air around the host of the evening grew strangely dense. The entire grand hall now turned its gaze toward Draco, hundreds of eyes belonging to the most powerful people in the city, all waiting for the reaction of the man who had just been declared an expectant father, and the air stretched tight like a cord about to snap. The murmuring slowly faded into a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind of silence in which people could hear even the beating of their own hearts. Sienna still stood there with one hand pressed to her stomach and tear-filled eyes fixed on him, waiting, while across the room the guests held their breath. Even the delicate clinking of glassware had stopped completely, everything suspended inside the moment when the fate of an entire alliance seemed to be waiting to be decided by the next few words from the mouth of the evening's host. And right in the middle of that absolute stillness, when every bit of attention in the room was focused in one single direction, from the threshold leading into the grand hall, from the shadowed corner where no crystal light reached, a small figure quietly stepped forward. It was Naomi, still in her plain maid's uniform, her calloused hands hanging at her sides, her hair tied neatly back, a woman whom no one in this glittering world had bothered to look back at once throughout the entire evening, or throughout the past 3 years, a person so invisible that at first her presence at the threshold didn't even make anyone take notice. She had been standing there for no one knew how long. Perhaps she had come upstairs looking for something she had forgotten, or perhaps something in her heart had urged her forward, and she had witnessed the entire declaration just now, had seen the pale face of the kind man who had saved her son, had understood that the small truth she held in her hands was no longer hers alone, and then, to her own astonishment, the woman who had grown used to lowering her head and swallowing every word into silence, took one more step into the light, her 2 hands tightening to hide their trembling, and in a voice that was soft yet clear enough to pierce straight through the silence of the entire grand hall, she spoke 8 words. "She isn't pregnant. I have the evidence." Those 8 words fell into the room like a bolt of lightning tearing across a still sky, And in that instant, the crystal wineglass Draco had been loosely holding slipped from his fingers, dropped onto the marble floor, and shattered into 100 pieces. The sharp ringing break sounded piercing in the crowd's stunned silence, red wine spreading across the white stone like a lake of blood, and that sound seemed to wake the entire room from its shock. Every head, every pair of eyes in the grand hall turned at once toward the maid standing at the threshold, the nameless woman who only a few seconds earlier had not existed in anyone's awareness, now suddenly becoming the center of everything. And across those hundreds of privileged faces appeared every shade of feeling: astonishment, doubt, outrage, curiosity. The outrage of people who saw the familiar order of their world broken by someone beneath them daring to speak, and the irresistible curiosity stirred by a drama even more thrilling than anything they had dared imagine. Sienna was the first to react. Her face changed at once, from tearful fragility into panicked pallor, then quickly wrapped itself in outrage. She snapped toward Naomi and hissed, "Who are you to dare? What could a lowly servant know that gives you the nerve to open your mouth and slander me in this place? Who allowed you up here?" Then, trembling, she turned toward the crowd as though begging for rescue. "Someone please get this woman out of here immediately. This is clearly some vile fabrication." But Sienna's voice had lost its usual steadiness. It had risen too high and become unusually rushed, and that very panic, instead of reassuring the crowd, only made the doubtful eyes begin to shift. 'Cause if that accusation were nothing more than the wild words of a madwoman, why would a privileged young lady become so frantic? In the midst of all of it, Draco remained still. He didn't look at Sienna, nor at the restless crowd beginning to stir. His eyes were fixed, straight on the small woman at the threshold, the woman who had dared to do what no one in this room overflowing with power had dared to do, dared to speak the truth when everything she stood to lose was more than anyone else. And in the look he gave her, amid that grand hall waiting to explode, there was no suspicion, but something close to gratitude and deep respect, because he knew the words she had just spoken were true, and he knew the price she was willing to pay to say them. In the face of Sienna's insults and her demand that Naomi be thrown out, Naomi did not step back, nor did she show the fear or confusion people might have expected from a servant being shouted at by a privileged young lady in front of a crowd. On the contrary, she drew in a deep breath, straightened her back, and the quiet dignity she had carried through so many years of being trampled by life now radiated from that posture, with a strength that neither money nor status could ever grant. "I know who I am," she replied, her voice not loud, yet strangely steady. "I'm only a servant. Someone no one in this room has bothered to look at for the past 3 years, but precisely because no one bothered to look at me, I was able to see the things everyone else missed. And what I'm about to say isn't slander, it's the truth, and I'm willing to bear every consequence if I'm wrong." Then she turned toward Draco and the guests, who stood stunned and listening, and she began to speak with the calm of someone who had carefully weighed every word before letting it leave her mouth. Without a shadow of a doubt, she pointed out the exact hidden location of the chemical blister packs in Miss Sienna's private room, contraceptive, and hormonal shifting drugs that physically made a pregnancy completely impossible. She exposed the cold, hard facts directly to the crowd, presenting an undeniable reality that instantly shattered the young lady's fabricated announcement. The moment Naomi's words ended, that piece of the puzzle immediately struck another piece. Draco had been keeping in his mind the unfinished fragment he had heard through the crack of the study door. The hidden man's voice, whispering that as for the baby, leave that alone for now, and there would be a way to handle it when the time came. And now those two separate fragments fitted together perfectly and coldly, confirming each other, supporting each other, making him understand that the maid's words were not the fabrication of someone jealous or deranged, but the final piece of a picture he himself had been silently assembling all night. That was why, when he spoke, his voice rang with absolute certainty. "I believe her," he said, and those 3 words from the mouth of the evening's host carried more weight than 1,000 arguments, shaking the grand hall once again, and Sienna, hearing her own fiancé stand with her accuser, turned visibly white. But what made Naomi different, what made her unlike any other person exposing a lie, was that when she spoke that truth, there was no pleasure in her voice, no triumph of someone who had just brought another person down, but something close to pity, because with the perceptive eyes of a woman who had once learned the work of caring for human beings, she had recognized something else, something she hesitantly continued to reveal. Among those blister packs, she said, there were also medicines she feared Miss Sienna might not have taken willingly, things that could make a person panicked, easily led, and robbed of the ability to think clearly. And she was afraid that Miss Sienna was not the mastermind behind all of this, but perhaps a victim herself, a chess piece moved by some hand behind the curtain and pushed into a position where she had to perform this tragic role. The moment those words were released, the grand hall erupted into another wave of commotion, but this time the attention began to shift. It was no longer focused entirely on accusation or defense. A new and uneasy question began to slip through the room. If the maid was right, then who was truly pulling the strings behind all of this? Who had used even a privileged young lady as a pawn in his dark game? And Sienna herself, when she heard those words, reacted in a way that stunned everyone. She didn't keep shouting or denying. Instead, her shoulders suddenly began to tremble. The eyes that had only pretended to be wet with tears now truly overflowed, and she stepped back as though the maid's words had stripped her bare of a truth she herself had been desperately trying to hide, from others and even from herself. Draco saw all of it, saw the collapse beginning to appear behind the perfect mask of the woman he had once intended to marry, and inside him, strangely, the anger he felt toward her softened somewhat, giving way to a bitter understanding, because he realized that his true enemy tonight was not the trembling Sienna Cross, but some shadow still hiding among this crowd, the one who had arranged everything, the one who had turned love, marriage, and even a life that had never existed into pieces on the chessboard of his ambition. And he slowly swept his eyes across the grand hall, searching for the face of the man he knew, for certain, was standing somewhere very close, watching his plan fall apart in helpless silence. Draco's gaze slowly swept across the grand hall, cutting through the restless faces, searching for the person he now knew was hiding somewhere very close. And then his eyes came to rest on a figure standing at the edge of the crowd. A man who still maintained his composure amid the chaos. A man who should not have drawn anyone's attention because he had always been present at every family event. It was Auguste Reyes, the head butler, the right-hand Draco had trusted for so many years. The instant their eyes met, Draco understood everything, because what he saw in Auguste's gaze was not the shock of a loyal man witnessing his master being harmed, but the cold and wary stare of an animal that had just realized its own trap was collapsing back upon itself. And the careful, low-voiced Draco had heard through the crack of the study door suddenly echoed with perfect clarity in his memory, matching with cruel precision the voice of the man standing before him. Draco walked toward him, slowly and calmly, and the crowd parted automatically to make a path for him. He stopped in front of Auguste and looked straight into the face of the man he had once regarded as one of his most trusted people. "So it was you," he said softly, his voice so low that only the few people nearest them could hear. Yet it carried a weight that made Auguste give a faint shudder. "All evening, I kept wondering who the hidden man in the study was, who drew me out of the grand hall with a false alarm, who turned Sienna into a puppet. I just didn't expect that he had been standing beside me for all these years." At first, Auguste still tried to put on a bewildered expression. "Sir, I don't understand what you're saying. I've always been loyal to the family." But that false calm quickly cracked beneath Draco's penetrating stare, and when he realized that every denial was useless, that the mask had fallen and could not be picked up again, his face gradually changed. The humble, respectful manner he had worn for years peeled away, revealing a bitterness and ambition that had been suppressed for far too long. Loyal Auguste let out a dry laugh. "I was loyal. I served this family with devotion from the days of your father. I did all the filthy work no one else wanted to touch. I gave my whole life to the Valentine bloodline, and what did I receive in return? A butler's title, an errand boy's command, a servant's fate for the rest of my life, while those who carried the Valentine name simply sat on the backs and shoulders of men like me." The entire grand hall listened in deathly silence to that confession filled with resentment, and Draco stood there, a deep ache rising inside him that he hid behind his cold expression, because this betrayal touched an old wound that had never truly healed in him, the ghost of another betrayal from many years before, when a trusted man his father had believed in completely had also stabbed him in the back in exactly this way. and now history seemed to be cruelly repeating itself before his eyes. You intended to turn Sienna into a tool so you could slip into the very center of the family's power, Draco said slowly, peeling back each layer of the conspiracy. Once the marriage was bound by a child, you would have your person planted right beside me. You would gradually manipulate, gradually seize control, gradually turn the empire my father built into your own from the inside, without needing to fire a single shot. It was a patient and cunning plan. I have to admit that. August did not deny it. He only looked at Draco with the defiant stare of a man who had gone too far to retreat. "What do you think you can do to me in front of all these people?" he said through clenched teeth. "If you touch me, this entire family will fall into chaos. I hold too many of your secrets." But Draco did not waver. He didn't shout. He didn't order his men to rush in. He only smiled faintly, a cold, confident smile belonging to a man who already knew victory was in his hands. "You've forgotten one thing, August," he said. "You thought you understood me because you stood beside me for years, but you never truly understood what my father taught me. He taught me that a man who builds power on people's hearts will stand firm, while a man who builds it on lies will collapse beneath the weight of his own deception. And you've just done exactly that. You've exposed yourself in front of both families. You've signed your own sentence with your own hand." He gave a slight signal, and the family's true loyalists, the faithful men August had never known were watching all along, quietly closed the circle around him. There was no rough noise, no scene of chaos, only the absolute authority of a crime lord being carried out in terrifying silence. And August, looking around and seeing that he was surrounded on every side, finally understood that the game he had spent so long arranging had completely collapsed, because of one link he had never calculated, an invisible maid he had scorned and driven away in the back garden, the very person who had brought down his entire castle of lies. As August was closed in by the ring of loyal men and led out of the grand hall in a silence heavy with authority, every eye in the room turned back toward Sienna, the woman still standing there in the circle of light, no longer a radiant young lady of privilege, but only a trembling figure, collapsing beneath the weight of the truth that had just been exposed. The perfect mask she had worked so hard to preserve throughout the evening, throughout so many years, finally shattered, and the tears rolling down her face now were no longer the calculated tears meant to buy the crowd's sympathy, but the real tears of a human being who had just been stripped bare in front of everyone she knew. Sienna sank slightly, one hand gripping the back of a chair to keep herself from falling, and through choking sobs she began to speak, not to deny her guilt, but to explain herself. "Everyone," she said, her voice breaking, "I know I was wrong. I took part in an unforgivable lie, and I don't expect anyone here to forgive me, but please, hear me out just once." She lifted her face and looked at Draco through the blur of tears, and in those eyes there was a true pain that made even the guests who had been furious soften against their will. "Do you know, Draco," she said, "I've been afraid. I've always been afraid that I wasn't good enough, afraid that this alliance only needed me as something to be traded, afraid that one day you would realize you had never truly needed me, and would leave me behind the way people discard something after it has lost its value." She told them that this constant fear of being cast aside had turned her into perfect prey for August, that he had approached her many months earlier, had poured sweet and poisonous words into her ear, had skillfully stirred every insecurity inside her, until she believed that if there wasn't a stronger bond to hold him, she would lose Draco forever, and that the plan to announce a pregnancy had been drawn up by him like a life raft for someone drowning in her own uncertainty. "I let him lead me," she confessed through her sobs. "I drank the things he gave me, without realizing they were eating away at my ability to think clearly. There were moments when my mind felt clouded, when I found myself doing things I normally would never have done, and by the time I understood I had sunk too deep, there was no way back. He held me captive with the very secrets he had tempted me into creating." The entire grand hall fell silent as it listened to that confession, and strangely, instead of contempt, something like pity began to rise in many hearts, because they realized that the woman kneeling there in ruin was not a cold-blooded monster, but only a weak human being who had been driven into the abyss by her own fear and by someone else's manipulation. Draco looked at her for a long time, and inside him rose a tangle of emotions too difficult to name. The hurt of a man who had been betrayed, the bitterness of a relationship that had never truly existed, but above all of it, a painful understanding and even compassion for someone he now recognized as another victim in August's game. He could crush her, he knew that. With only a word, he could destroy her reputation and the entire Cross family forever, could turn her into a laughingstock and a disgrace for the rest of her life. And no one would blame him if he did after everything she had helped set in motion. But Draco didn't do that, because his father had once taught him that the true measure of a man was not found in how he treated the powerful, but in how he treated someone who had fallen at his feet. So he slowly stepped forward, bent down, and in a voice that had softened greatly, said, "Stand up, Sienna. A woman like you shouldn't be kneeling like this in front of people who may not be any better than you." He told her that she would have to testify, that she would have to reveal the whole truth about August and his conspiracy so justice could be done, and in return, he would give her a path to leave with dignity. She could quietly withdraw, heal, and begin her life again somewhere else, without having to carry the mark of disgrace for the rest of her days. Sienna looked up at him, her eyes filled with stunned disbelief, because she had prepared herself for the cruelest punishment, yet what she received was a way out and a mercy she knew very well she didn't deserve. "Why?" she whispered faintly. "Why would you treat me kindly after everything I've done?" And Draco only answered softly, "Because destroying someone who has already fallen proves nothing about strength. You've been imprisoned by your own fear for too long, and I hope this time you'll have enough courage to free yourself." Then he straightened, leaving that woman with tears that now carried an entirely different meaning. Tears of repentance and of a fragile ray of hope that had just been lit. In the separate side room where August had been taken, the traitor sat under the watch of loyal men. The arrogant defiance he had shown earlier now, almost entirely gone, leaving only the bitterness of a man who had gambled everything and lost it all. And when Draco stepped inside, August lifted his head and looked at him with the eyes of someone who already knew his fate had been decided. Draco did not touch him, did not raise his voice, because he understood that the most frightening punishment for a man like August was not blows or violence, but the stripping away of everything he had longed for, and the loss of every road back. "You will answer to the law for what you've done," he said in a calm voice. "Every piece of evidence, every statement, will be sent to the proper place, and the network of connections you once leaned on to climb higher will not have a single person left willing to reach out and save you, because in our world, nothing is more despised than a traitor who has been exposed." He told him that he would not stain his hands with blood, that he would not turn himself into the kind of man August had imagined him to be. Instead, he would let justice, both the justice of the law and the unspoken justice of the world they lived in, finish its work, and August would have the rest of his life to think about the day he traded his loyalty and his character for a hollow ambition. August lowered his head and had nothing left to say, because he understood that the sentence Draco had just delivered was the cruelest thing possible for a man who had spent his whole life craving power and status. It was to be pushed back into the nothingness he feared most, to be stripped of everything and abandoned by an entire world, and Draco turned and walked out, closing the door behind him along with a dark chapter of his life. When he returned to the hallway, the temporary security men, who had roughly restrained him in the back garden earlier, were standing clustered together, their faces pale, because by now they knew that the disheveled man they had pinned against the stone wall was in truth the master of this entire mansion, and they were waiting for his rage to fall upon their heads. One man had collapsed to his knees begging forgiveness. Another trembled and stammered without managing to form a full sentence. But Draco stopped in front of them and looked over each of them, and what he did left them all stunned. He did not punish them, did not dismiss them, did not give them a single harsh word of blame. Instead, he simply said with calm restraint that he understood they had acted under orders they believed were right, that they were only working men who had been used by a cunning person like pieces on a board, just like so many others that night, and he would not make them pay for a mistake they had never intended to cause. But then he added one more thing, and though his voice was soft, it made every man among them lower his head. "I want you to remember one thing for the rest of your lives," he said. "Tonight, you saw a poorly dressed man holding a child in the dark, and you immediately decided he was something wicked who deserved to be trampled. You judged a human being only by the clothes on his body, and that is the greatest mistake anyone can make. because people reveal who they truly are, not by how they treat the powerful, but by how they treat those they believe are nothing at all. Those words sank into every man standing there like a lesson they would never forget, and they bowed their heads, no longer out of fear, but out of honest shame, because they understood that if the man they had despised tonight had not been the powerful owner of the mansion, but truly had been a poor and lowly man, the way they treated him still would have been just as shameful, because a person's dignity does not depend on his clothing or his position. Draco left that lesson with them and walked on, and inside him, the theme that had repeated itself in his mind all night now became clearer than ever, that this entire glittering empire, this whole world of power in which he lived, had grown far too used to sorting people into worthy and unworthy, visible and invisible, and that blind habit had almost brought him down, because the traitor had been respected while the honest one was driven away. The liar had stood beneath the lights while the one who spoke the truth had been pushed into the dark. And he told himself that if this night had taught him anything, it was that he had to learn to see the people his world had always been accustomed to looking past, that he had to learn to honor the quiet dignity hidden behind old uniforms and calloused hands, because sometimes those invisible people were the only ones still brave enough to speak the truth, when all the powerful chose silence. In the days after that fateful night, when the Valentine mansion had returned to its usual quiet, an august dark shadow had been cleared from every corner. Draco still couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had dared to step forward and speak the truth, and inside him there was an urge to learn more about her life, not out of curiosity, but out of sincere respect for the person who had saved both him and his family from disaster. He had his people quietly look into Naomi Hart's past, and when the information was brought back and placed on his desk, there was one detail that stunned him so deeply he had to read it again and again, because the construction company had once placed all blame on her late husband in order to avoid paying compensation. This company, which had pushed a young woman and her little child into hardship with a cowardly false accusation, turned out to be a business partner of a small branch within the very empire he led. Draco had never known about this connection. It lay on a distant and deeply buried layer inside the tangled network of the family's subsidiaries and partners, one name among countless others he couldn't possibly watch over one by one. But now that the truth had appeared before his eyes, he felt a weight pressed down on his chest, because even though he had been entirely uninvolved in the tragedy of her family, even though he had never known they existed until only a few days before, the thought that his empire had been connected, even indirectly, to that woman's injustice made it impossible for him to sit still. He immediately summoned the heads of that construction company to meet him, and in the crime lord's office, the men who had spent years comfortably evading responsibility now had to face a truth they had believed buried forever. Draco placed before them the entire file on the accident from years ago, the evidence showing that the real fault belonged to the company's negligence and not to the dead worker. And he looked straight into their eyes and told them that this deception ended today. He declared that he would sever every business relationship between the family and that company unless they agreed to do one thing properly: officially acknowledge the innocence of Naomi's late husband, restore his honor, and provide fair compensation for the years she and her son had been forced to endure in injustice and poverty. And before the undeniable authority of the man who held the life of their business in his hands, those men who had once been callous and unmoved finally had no choice but to bow their heads and accept. Draco also quietly ordered a review of every similar case that the company had once denied responsibility for, and he realized that Naomi's family had not been the only victim. Several other families had also been pushed into similar misery, and he quietly forced the company to do right by all of them, turning this delayed justice into something greater than the story of one person alone. When everything had been properly arranged, Draco invited Naomi to come, and he personally handed her the official file clearing the name of her late husband, along with the document confirming the compensation she should have received many years earlier. Naomi took those papers in trembling hands, and as her eyes moved over each line, as she understood that the name of the husband she loved had finally been washed clean of the unjust stain he should never have had to carry, her shoulders began to shake, and tears rolled down her face. But they were not the tears of suffering she had cried far too many times throughout the years. They were the tears of a deep release, the feeling of an invisible burden that had pressed on her shoulders for so long finally being lifted away. He wasn't at fault, she whispered through her tears. I always knew he wasn't at fault, but for all these years no one would believe me. No one would listen. They let him leave this world carrying a false accusation, and now, at last he can rest in peace. Draco stood silently watching her, and inside him rose an emotion difficult to name, because he understood that what he had just given her was not money. Money could never buy back the lost years or the person who was gone. What he had given her was something far more precious than that, the truth, honor, the right to lift her head and speak of her husband as an honest man instead of a sinner. I'm deeply sorry it came this late, he said softly. You shouldn't have had to wait so long to receive what you deserved from the very beginning. Naomi lifted her face to look at him, her eyes still wet but shining with a gratitude no words could fully express. Late is better than never, she replied, and you don't know, this gift is greater than anything you could imagine, because now I can look into my son's eyes and tell him that his father was a good man, and that he can be proud of him. That night, when the entire mansion had sunk into sleep, and the vast corridors held only the echo of his own lonely footsteps, Draco sat alone in his study, the desk lamp casting a warm circle of light, and before him lay his father's old tarnished badge, the one he often took out and touched, whenever his heart was unsettled by things he could not yet name. He was deep in thought about everything that had happened, when the phone on the desk softly lit up, a message sent from an internal number within the mansion, and when he opened it, he realized it was from Naomi, simple lines she had written to thank him for everything he had done for her and her son. But at the end of the message, there was something that made the hand holding his phone stop still, because she wrote that there was something she had kept in her heart, since the night he saved Eli in the back garden. Something she had only now found the courage to say, that the very soft voice he used when he bent down to soothe her son in the darkness had awakened in her, a memory she had carried for 4 years, as though holding on to the only ray of light in the darkest stretch of her life. She told him that 4 years earlier, on a stormy night, when Eli was still a newborn baby and had fallen into a critical condition that required emergency care, when she stood frozen before the hospital payment counter with 2 empty hands and a shattered heart, a strange man had quietly stepped forward, paid the entire bill, then turned and walked back into the rain before she could see his face clearly. And the only thing she still remembered about that nameless benefactor was a very soft voice when he bent down and told her that the baby would be all right, along with the sight of his back gradually disappearing into the darkness, his dark sweater soaked through with rainwater. For 4 years, she had silently carried that blurred figure with her, had heard people whisper about a secretive master, who often helped others quietly without leaving his name, and it was that fragile hope, the thought that perhaps he was the man who had saved her child, that had brought her feet to the gates of this mansion to ask for a cleaning position. Then for 3 years, she had waited in silence, never once coming close enough to learn the truth, until that fateful night, when that same very soft voice rang out again in the darkness, as he held her frightened child in his arms, and in that moment she recognized it. She knew with certainty that the man kneeling on the cold ground saving her son was the nameless benefactor she had quietly searched for all those years. Draco read those lines and went completely still, because in his memory, that stormy night 4 years ago returned only faintly, like one of the countless times he had quietly helped strangers he happened to meet along the road of life, then forgotten soon afterward, never leaving his name, never hoping to be repaid, because that was exactly the way his father had taught him to live, to give in silence and never turn kindness into a debt someone else had to carry. He had never imagined that one of those many quiet acts had planted a seed of destiny, that the woman and child he had happened to help in the rain all those years ago were Naomi and Eli, that the thin thread he had released into the darkness 4 years earlier would weave itself into the very moment she stepped forward to save his entire life in the grand hall that night. And then he suddenly understood the thing that had made him stop still, in the back garden when Eli mumbled the name Sal in his sleep. Because Naomi went on to write that on that fateful night, she had vaguely caught the name Sal from the stranger before he disappeared. After that night, Naomi had kept that memory alive, constantly telling little Eli as he grew up about his father's last days, and the kind man named Sal who saved his life, as if hearing a story about a hero from a fairy tale, until the name had imprinted itself into the child's young subconscious, so that on that frightened, lost night in the back garden, when a man with a gentle voice held him and protected him, he had unconsciously spoken that beloved name. Draco set the phone down, and he sat motionless for a long time in the warm circle of lamplight, a feeling both choked and warm rising in his chest, because the name Sal was the affectionate name of his father, the name Draco sometimes used to hide his true identity whenever he quietly helped people, as a way of carrying his father with him in the good things he did. And now he understood that his father, though long gone, was still present in every thread of this strange tapestry of fate. And in the final line of the message, Naomi wrote a sentence that made his heart fall silent. She wrote that now she understood why, whenever someone mentioned his father's name, they spoke it with deep respect, rather than with the fear people usually had for other powerful men, because a father who had raised a son capable of quietly saving strangers on a rainy night, without needing anyone to know, must have been a great man in a way that money and power could never measure. And when he read that, the man the whole city feared slowly reached out and touched his father's old badge, and for the first time in many years, his eyes stung. A few weeks after the fateful night that had turned everything upside down, a clear November morning filled the Valentine mansion, warm golden sunlight pouring through the tall windows and spreading a shimmering carpet of light across the marble floor that had witnessed so many upheavals, and that space, once cold and solemn, now suddenly seemed strangely alive because of a sound it had not heard through all those years, the bright, ringing laughter of a child. Eli, stronger and rosier now, thanks to the rounds of treatment Draco had quietly arranged for him with the finest doctors, was scampering down the hallway with Bunny tucked under one arm, and when he saw Draco's tall, familiar figure step out, his small face lit up with joy. "Uncle Draco," he cried, then rushed straight toward him, and wrapped his arms around Draco's leg with all the innocent trust of a child who had come to see him as part of his little world. Draco bent down and lifted the boy into his arms, and across the face of the man the whole city had once feared appeared a rare and warm smile, the kind of smile very few people in the world had ever seen. "Good morning, young man," he said. "Is Bunny hungry this morning?" Eli giggled and answered that Bunny was very hungry, and so was he, and so the three of them sat down together at the dining table where the morning sunlight was dancing, Draco, Naomi, and little Eli, sharing a simple but warm breakfast in the way a real family gathers around one another. Naomi no longer wore the maid's uniform, because Draco had given her an entirely new position in the mansion, a role in management and supervision worthy of her true ability, and he had made it clear to her that this was not charity or pity, but recognition, because her sharp observing eyes, her ability to see what an entire circle of his trusted people had missed, had saved his whole family from disaster, and a person with that kind of insight and courage deserved to be placed where her gifts would be valued, not buried behind cleaning work. During that breakfast, while Eli was busily telling Bunny about the dreams he had the night before, Draco quietly took from his coat pocket the old engagement ring, the very ring Eli's little hands had returned to him on that fateful night, and he placed it on the table, gently but decisively, as though laying down an entire old chapter of his life that he was ready to close. Naomi looked at the ring, then lifted her eyes to him, and she understood, without needing a single explanation, that this was his way of saying goodbye to a past built on arrangements and lies, so he could step toward a future built on something more real, more sincere. Between the two of them, there was no confession of love, no rushed promise, only a quiet understanding slowly growing through mornings like this, a feeling nurtured little by little from respect and gratitude rather than calculation, and both of them understood that some of the most beautiful things in life did not need to be named too quickly, only allowed to grow in their own time. Draco looked at the mother and child sitting before him in the morning light, and inside him there suddenly echoed something that a life spent among power and guardedness had never taught him, but that one child and one poor mother had taught him in a single night, that the greatest power a person could possess was not the ability to make others tremble in fear, but the ability to make a frightened child dare to rest his head in trust against his shoulder, and that the most important measure of a person was not what they displayed beneath the lights, but what they quietly did when they believed no one was watching. The story of Draco, Naomi, and little Eli reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a person's dignity is never measured by the clothes they wear or the position they hold, that sometimes those the world treats as invisible are the very ones who carry within them the light of truth and courage, and that a quiet act of kindness, small as it may seem, can plant seeds of destiny that bloom in ways we could never have expected, because goodness given without expecting repayment never truly disappears. It simply waits to return at the very moment we need it most. If today's story has touched your heart in some way, if Draco, Naomi, or little Eli has made you smile or brought tears to your eyes, please take a moment to press the like button, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that every day you can hear many more meaningful and captivating stories. We would love to know how you felt. Which moment in the story moved you the most? Was it the image of the little boy resting his head in trust within a stranger's arms in the darkness? Or the moment the invisible maid dared to step forward and speak the truth? Leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always read and cherish every line you share with us. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story until its final moments. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.